There is no other way to create an emotional connection with others but being emotionally vulnerable. Without vulnerability, relationships lack trust, closeness, and intimacy. They become superficial and surface level relationships that lack depth and mutual understanding. What is emotional vulnerability? Emotional vulnerability is the process of acknowledging and opening up about negative emotions such as anger, resentment, sadness, loneliness, guilt, and shame. It is important for you to be able to acknowledge these difficult feelings by being vulnerable with yourself first. This requires introspection, patience, and the knowledge of how to process your emotions. I just made a video about this last week, so go check that one out if you haven't already. It's called 5 Steps to Process Your Emotions in a Healthy Way. It is perhaps just as important to be emotionally vulnerable with other people. This involves acknowledging and sharing the difficult feelings that you have that stem from what are considered negative emotions. Brené Brown has said, vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and to be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. That's the end of the quote. Did you hear that? Vulnerability is not weakness. It requires our greatest measure of courage. What is courage? Courage is basically the ability to do something that scares you or that is painful. Being emotionally vulnerable with others is not easy, but I promise you that it is worth it. Of course, it is hard to share some of the messy parts of life with another person, especially because you are not in control of the outcome. Why is it important to be emotionally vulnerable with others? Number 1, vulnerability is the source of a meaningful and authentic life. Brené Brown said, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. That's the end of the quote. Number 2, vulnerability allows us to be truly seen and to have strong and lasting connections with others. Another quote from Brené Brown says, I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, and when they derive sustenance and strength from the relationship. End of quote. There is no other way to create an emotional connection with others but by being emotionally vulnerable. Without vulnerability, relationships lack trust, closeness, and intimacy. They become superficial and surface level relationships that lack depth and mutual understanding. Why is it hard to be emotionally vulnerable with other people? Shame. Shame is a strong emotion that makes people feel like there's something wrong with themselves. Shame makes people want to hide their true selves out of fear of rejection. Shame makes people feel like if their true self were to come out, people would not accept them for who they truly are. Shame is largely driven by fear and insecurities. Gender stereotypes. Although gender stereotypes aren't as prominent as they used to be, they are still very influential in the world today. According to society, women and men are supposed to act certain ways in social settings. Women are generally expected to be quiet, submissive, and nurturing. Men are generally expected to be ambitious, tough, and somewhat emotionless. We need to be aware of gender stereotypes because they often keep people from being vulnerable. Weakness. Oftentimes, society sees being vulnerable as weakness. This keeps you from telling other people how you truly feel and from living an authentic life. Brené Brown said, vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't comfortable, but they're never weakness. That's the end of the quote. Do not associate difficult emotions with failure or liabilities. Feeling negative emotions does not mean that you have failed, but that you are having a full human experience. There is nothing weak about acknowledging, understanding, and opening up about your emotions. Past traumas. Of course, past traumas play a major role in our willingness to be vulnerable with other people. You might have come from a childhood that included bullying, emotional or verbal abuse, physical abuse, neglect, or other tough issues. When you have experienced one or more of these challenges, you have strong neural networks in your brain that tell you that you are unsafe, that it is unsafe to share parts of yourself with other people. It is unsafe to open up yourself. Because of these hardwired connections in your brain, it may feel very hard to trust people with the raw, unfiltered, and hidden parts of yourself. Lack of self-awareness. Emotional vulnerability requires you to know yourself very well. If you are not spending time being introspective or observing your own mental and emotional patterns, you will not realize that there are parts of yourself that are even worth sharing with others. Especially with social media, it is easy to think that we need to act a certain way, think a certain way, believe certain things, and perhaps fit a mold. As humans, we naturally want to fit in with other people, even if there isn't a sense of true belonging. Because of this, we tend to adopt other people's beliefs and ways of life. It is less scary to try to blend in than it is to truly get to know yourself and expose your true self. Perfectionism. For this topic, I want to read a long quote from an article by Brené Brown called The 20-Ton Shield of Perfectionism. Brené says, "Why, when we know that there's no such thing as perfect, do most of us spend an incredible amount of time and energy trying to be everything to everyone? Is it that we really admire perfection? No. The truth is that we are actually drawn to people who are real and down to earth. We love authenticity, and we know that life is messy and imperfect. We get sucked into perfection for one very simple reason. We believe perfection will protect us. Perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfect, look perfect, and act perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. We all need to feel worthy of love and belonging, and our worthiness is on the line when we feel we are never enough. We are never beautiful enough, smart enough, extraordinary enough, talented enough, popular enough, promoted enough, admired enough, or accomplished enough. Perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be our best. Perfectionism is not about healthy achievement and growth. It's a shield. Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact it's the thing that's really preventing us from being seen and taking flight." End of quote. I've talked about why it is hard to be emotionally vulnerable with others. What does emotional vulnerability actually look like in social situations, though? It can look like telling someone when they've hurt you, offended you, or crossed a boundary in an honest, straightforward, and level-headed manner. Sharing a detail about yourself that you don't normally share with others. Admitting to mistakes that you have made. Sharing some of the difficult emotions you're experiencing, like grief and anger. Reconnecting with or reconciling with someone. Implementing healthy boundaries fueled by compassion rather than blame. Confessing romantic feelings for someone. Dressing and acting in a way that feels authentic to you, even if you are different from everyone else. Asking someone for help when you are going through a hard time, or saying no to someone when it doesn't align with your core values or is not how you wish to spend your time and energy. Of course, there are more examples than these, but hopefully these give a well-rounded idea of what emotional vulnerability looks like in everyday life. Vulnerability is not a way to manipulate others into doing you favors or a way to have others pity you and your situation. I challenge you today to be more emotionally vulnerable with the people that matter most to you in your life. Vulnerability requires you to be honest with others about who you are, how you want to live your life, and what you are truly feeling. It requires you to take off your mask of perfection and live in your truth, no matter what the consequences. When I start to feel nervous to open up to others, I remember one of my favorite quotes that is said to be by Dr. Seuss. It says, "Be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind." Lastly, I would like to share one of Brené Brown's most famous quotes about vulnerability again. She said, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path." Like I said before, there is no other way to create an emotional connection with others but being emotionally vulnerable. Without vulnerability, relationships lack trust, closeness, and intimacy. They become superficial and surface-level relationships that lack depth and mutual understanding. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Emotional Stability.